Transport Research Partnership, c'est un partenariat qui regroupe à la fois des chercheurs de la Californie, de l'Ontario et du Québec. Je vais commencer tout de suite par les remerciements d'usage. Je remercie le Consulat des États-Unis, l'Institut québécois du carbone et l'IET pour avoir contribué financièrement à l'organisation de cet événement. Je remercie l'Université de Montréal et Polytechnique pour leur soutien logistique dans l'organisation de tout ça. Et plus particulièrement, Louis-Charles Coder de l'Institut québécois du carbone et Audrey Rondeau de l'Institut de l'énergie Trottier qui ont été essentiels à l'organisation de tout ça. La soirée se déroulera on aura cinq conférences, une seule période de questions à la toute fin, donc je vous demande de prendre en note vos questions pour la fin de l'événement. Et sans plus tarder, je vais passer la parole à Mark Purdon, qui est le coordonnateur de la branche québécoise de cette initiative. Mark?
Merci. Voilà, donc c'est pas je ne voulais pas prendre beaucoup de temps, mais je voulais quand même présenter un petit peu sur notre initiative. Donc c'est Joint Clean Climate Transport Research Partnership, on lise le nom en anglais, mais j'imagine que tout le monde est à l'aise avec ça. Mais peut-être je vais juste switcher en anglais parce que vous voyez que je suis un anglophone, donc pourquoi le cacher? So it's a transport and climate policy initiative, and what we're trying to do is well, I'll switch to the next slide, is to bring together engineers, economists, policy experts, and practitioners from across Quebec, California, Ontario, and other relevant jurisdictions who are working on issues related to climate change and transport policy. So we have folks from all three of these jurisdictions, as well as two participants here from Vermont. So we have our expert panel, which comprises of Mousseau, who I'm sure you know if you are into energy issues here in Quebec. We also have Clairman, who will be speaking from Ontario's perspective. Two participants from California will be speaking, Julie Whitcover and Christopher Bush. And finally, from Vermont, we have Jennifer Wallace-Brodeur. But I also want to acknowledge that we have, in addition to the speakers who will be speaking today, we also have a number of other participants in this initiative here. Maya Yegin, who is a professor at UQAM. Genevieve Giuliano, who is a professor from University of Southern California. Chelsea Hosenauer from the Climate Registry, also based in California. And also Jonathan Dowds from the University of Vermont, and Colleen Hosner, who's a PhD student from York University, Ontario. And this is an initiative we're trying to bring together and to build, well, if we get the money and we get the grant proposal in, hopefully we'll have more activity in this area, workshops similar to this one in California, Ontario, and perhaps also in Vermont. And the idea is that these three jurisdictions are now linked by a common carbon market. So what happens in each of the other jurisdictions will have material effects in Quebec. And we also know that the transport sector is the largest source of emissions in all three of these jurisdictions, and I believe also in Vermont as well. So it's a challenge, but it's a common challenge, and there's, I think, a strong interest in collaboration. So with that, I'll turn it back to Louis, who I guess will be chairing this session.
Merci. So our first speaker will be is Normand Mousseau, who's going to talk about the Quebec part of this challenge. He's the academic director of the IET, as well as a professor of physics at Université de Montréal. In a past life, he's been the co-chairman of the Commission on the Energy Issues in Quebec, la Commission sur les enjeux énergétiques du Québec, 2014. So, without further introduction, Normand.
Merci beaucoup, Louis. Bonsoir, c'est un plaisir d'être ici. Je vais parler en anglais pour être sûr qu'aussi nos invités comprennent. S'il y a quoi que ce soit, n'hésitez pas, vous pouvez poser des questions en français ou en anglais. So, we have 10 minutes. So 10 minutes doesn't give much time for subtleties and nuances. So, if you know me, you know I'm not so strong in nuances and subtleties. So, it matches my kind of approach to life. So first, let me present l'Institut de l'Énergie Trottier, whose mission is to prepare and accompany the energy transition by supporting the training of engineers. So on the campus here at Polytechnique, at Université de Montréal, at HEC, we support students. There's a program, we also help coordinate a program in energy, master in engineering energy. And we also sustain, we have a number of research grants that we give to research for sustainable solution, and we are quite involved in communication and explaining the issues on energy in Quebec and Canada. So let's go back a bit to what happened in Quebec. So in Quebec, the climate issue started about 10 years ago, you could say, with the creation of the Green Fund in 2006 that was accompanying the first, an energy policy at that point, climate policy, without really a first action plan that was really introduced in 2012. So the first action plan on climate change, which is the PAC 2020, so 2013-2020, was introduced in 2012 with a target of reducing by 20% greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 to 2020. Okay? And then in 2015, we introduced the carbon market a bit before, but the big date, I would say, is January 1st, 2015, when we joined with California into an international carbon market, which will expand its international aspect with Ontario joining the market soon. Okay, so sorry, that's a Quebec joke, but okay. And then essentially in 2016 and 2015, Quebec government also added its new target for 2030, which is a reduction of 37.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. What you see here is the plot in the document, Cible de réduction d'émissions, the document that served to introduce the 37.5 planning, okay? And essentially what were on the graph was the blue line, which shows that with the current policies in Quebec, we cannot meet the target of 2020, and we will be quite off the target of 2030. Okay, and we're still waiting for an action plan that would bring us to 2020. It's too late, but to 2030, we still have nothing at hand. Okay. So what's the energy? Because I'm getting to transportation, so I have first to go around through energy, because transport, greenhouse gas emission and transport are all about energy. So let's remind people that Quebec is quite unique in its energy consumption and its energy pie, because 44% of the energy it consumes is renewable, and a part that is decreasing. So over the last few years, we were 47% of renewable a few years ago. Now we're at 44%. So oil and gas is growing. Okay. We had in April 2016 an energy strategy that was deposited by the government. Strategy is a big word, but there was energy targets, one could say, for 2030, which are, that you can see here, improve by 15% energy efficiency, reduce oil consumption by 40%, okay, eliminate thermal coal, etc. When you sum up all these actions, at best you reduce by 30% greenhouse gas emissions. So this policy, which was deposited 6 months after the climate change target, is off by 7.5% at least, okay? So we cannot reach the climate change objectives with the energy policy that the same government has adopted. Now let's go in transportation. Transportation, we have not made any significant progress since 1990. Like almost every other place on Earth, essentially, transportation grows, sorry, and greenhouse gas emission increase in transportation sector. So it's a very tough sector to crack, and we are here because nobody has really the answer for that. So what we see is that on the road, so overall we've peaked around in 2011 and we're slowly going down. We're still up from 1990 though, but on the road itself we have not managed to move at all over the last 5 years. So essentially we're not moving to our goal of reducing 20%. And transportation in Quebec is 44% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we don't make progress there, that puts a lot of pressure on the rest of the economy. At the moment, all we can rest on, we're still waiting. So we have a policy on electrification of transportation, which was adopted in 2015, 2020. We have a law on zero emission vehicles that was adopted recently this year, which plans to have 3.4% of low carbon or zero emission vehicles on the market next year. They have to be sold by the constructor, otherwise there's penalties, going up to 15% in 2020. Today, it's only 0.7% of all the fleet that is electric, so it's quite small. And we're still waiting for a policy on sustainable transportation, which is promised for April next year. Okay, so we'll see if we meet this target. At the moment, that's essentially what we have in transportation. So sadly, it's very easy to tell you what we have in Quebec in terms of transportation policy for transition. We have a goal of getting 100,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2020. We add roughly 100,000 new vehicles on the road per year. Okay, so that will not even cover 1/5 of what we've added between 2015 and 2020. So it's an important target, but it will not have much impact on greenhouse gas emissions. There's a goal of reducing by 150,000 kilotons, 150,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year in transportation until 2020. That's 0.5% of the emissions in transportation. So we cannot get 20% by summing 0.5% over 5 years. Okay? The best we get is 2.5%. And to create 5,000 new jobs in the electric vehicle sector with investment of $500 million. Nobody creates job at $100,000. Okay? That doesn't happen. But that's another story. Okay? I'm not discussing industrial policy here. So that's the sad part of where we are. Okay? So in conclusion, in Quebec, we have ambitious goals, at least for 2030. We have a lot of objectives that are not connected, and that's a problem, because how do you make sure you have a coherent transformation if the various objectives are not aligned? There's no link from these objectives to technology, social transformation, fairness, sustainability. There's no direct pathway in transportation. All we have is electric cars. Okay? So that doesn't solve anything, because it doesn't solve the number of cars that is being put on the road. There's no vision of transporting goods and people over car and trucks, which is the direction that most countries are taking when they want to reach their goals. You have to abandon the idea you want to move cars efficiently, but you want to move our people and goods. Okay? And innovation is not well targeted. We often target innovation which is already too late by the time we think about it. So we don't have a structure to get to innovation at the right time. It's sad to say this, because you will hear some nice things from California, and in Canada and in Quebec we are almost as developed as countries as California, not quite. We don't have Google, or we don't have Amazon is not in California, so that doesn't count, sorry. We should be able to do much better than we are doing, and that's a problem. So thank you very much.
Merci, Normand. Still have 1.5 minutes to go. That's great. So our second presenter is Cara Clairman. She's the CEO of Plug and Drive, which is from Ontario. She's an environmental professional with a great experience in environment and sustainability fields in both the public and private sectors. So it gives interesting views, not only from the academic sector. So Cara, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I was just saying to Normand, it's sort of sad because often in Ontario we point to Quebec as, the great leader in Canada on electrified transportation. So that's a little bit depressing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Ontario, mostly focusing on electrification. Thank you. and some of the policies, and hopefully we'll get a chance for some questions. Like in Quebec, transportation is the largest emitting sector in Ontario. So without tackling transportation, we can't hit our climate goals. We can't come anywhere near them, actually. And it's kind of interesting because I come from the electricity sector. I spent many years working in electricity. And when I started in electricity, electricity was the largest emitting sector in Ontario because we had coal plants. We also had nuclear and hydro, but we had 4 or 5 large coal plants. And so, in fact, if you had looked at this pie 10, 15 years ago, that green section that says electricity, that would have been the biggest. And so, of course, as that has gotten smaller and smaller, transportation becomes the elephant in the room. It becomes the thing we have to tackle. So on the good news side, okay, we've cleaned up our electricity grid, which means now electricity, which used to be the problem, is part of the solution. So that it shows how quickly things can change, which gives you maybe some hope that we can pull this off. But that slice of the pie now is basically some natural gas that we have left on our electricity grid. Otherwise, Ontario's grid is primarily nuclear and hydroelectric with a little bit of wind and solar. And so if you plug into Ontario at night, it's virtually greenhouse gas free. Just a very tiny bit of fossil fuel running, and most of our fossil fuel, if it runs at all, it runs at the peak, which is typically in the day. So for the most part, EVs, you're going to plug in at night. So it's a very nice match with Ontario's grid in terms of the ability to drop emissions. So that's good. The other thing we like to say, so we've got a big potential for reducing emissions using electricity as the fuel for cars. Also, it's a lot cheaper, true here in Quebec too, so there's an economic reason to do it. Also, the story we like to tell, and I think in Quebec it's a powerful story, is that electricity is made locally. So when you plug in your car, you're plugging into locally made electricity, local jobs, local infrastructure, instead of buying oil and gas, which tends to come from somewhere else. And so for all those reasons, sort of we've got the business cases there, for EV. Now we talk a little bit about how we're going to get people to do it. That's what Plug and Drive is all about. We do education, we help with infrastructure, and we work on policy issues as well. We do it by getting out there with cars, and we offer ride and drives. We've done them here, and actually there's some really great events that happen here locally, and we do find it's really key to get people to try the cars. If they don't try the cars, they'll never be persuaded to buy the cars. And so although it seems probably pretty obvious, automakers call it butts in seats. You have to do that, or you can't sell it to people. But I thought it'd be helpful for you folks to see, Normand alluded to it, the numbers. How are we doing in terms of EV adoption? So you can see in Canada-wide, we are getting close to 40,000 cars. And those are divided average about a third, Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. Why? Those 3 provinces have incentive programs, economic incentives. And so, you can show incentives work. They barely sell any electric cars in any of the rest of the provinces of Canada because there is no financial incentive. So that shows incentives work. They're needed right now because we're in those early days of the market. We believe that when price parity comes, when an electric car is basically the same price as a gas car, we wouldn't need incentives anymore. People like Bloomberg predict that's going to happen around 2022. So we're not far from that, but we do need incentives for a couple more years, and so that policy seems to be quite effective. It exists in Quebec, BC, Ontario. And you see on this graph, the green is real data from the past, and the blue is predictions. Navigant predicts we are going to have an explosion of EV adoption. They base this on a number of assumptions. So many more makes and models available than are available today. We see this year over year, doubling right now, sort of an exponential growth. Our sales have doubled this year from last and doubled from the year before. So that is expected to continue. More dealerships making them available, more styles. And it's surprising how important that is, but people are very brand loyal. in auto. If you're a Volkswagen person, usually you stick with Volkswagen and Toyota, and if Volkswagen doesn't have an EV, well, you're going to wait. And we have found that to be the case in our research, that people are waiting for Toyota to have one, or for Volvo to have one. And of course, they all will have one in the next few years. So again, if you look at that red, I guess it shows up red or burgundy for you, Ontario sold about 15,000 EVs to date. And what we are, our goal, our policy stated goal in Ontario is 5% of new sales by 2020. We're at 1% today. Now, interesting, if you look at this graph, Navigant, which is a very respected research outfit, predicts we're going to blow past that target in 2020. I hope they're right. It seems ambitious because we're at 1% today and we're to get to 5% by 2020, and that's only 2.5 years away, not even. So I'm not sure, but I'm optimistic, but this is challenging. And so what policy, are we doing besides these incentives to help make that happen? There's a series of things Ontario is doing, and I'll just sort of summarize the top ones. I told you about the incentives. Quebec's incentive is $8,000. Ontario is giving up to $14,000 off the price of a car. Unbelievably rich incentives. This government is getting actually quite a lot of criticism for that, but they are doing their job. In fact, in this past quarter, it's the first time Ontario sold more EVs than Quebec. So we like to say it's because of all the hard work Plug and Drive is doing, but we know it's the 14 grand off the price of the car. Also, we give an incentive on charging stations. They have that in Quebec as well. It's 50% up to a cap of $2,000. You get about $1,000 back. We're changing a lot of our codes and standards. So we've got changes to the building code, changes to the Condo Act to make it easier to plug in. We've got a big plan. The government has planned a program for workplace charging where they're going to provide additional incentive to workplaces to install charging stations. Studies out of California show that if your workplace has a charging station, you're 6 times more likely to buy the car. Of course, they are funding education and awareness programs like the work that Plug and Drive is doing. They're doing things beyond straight light-duty cars. They've got funding for school buses, which is a really exciting program in Ontario. I think school buses are actually perfect for electrification. They only drive for an hour, then they sit most of the day, then they drive again for an hour, then they sit all night. And so they can easily be electrified, and most routes it can work. So this is a really great opportunity because school buses actually are typically diesel and are typically very, very bad emitters, not just of greenhouse gases, but of other air pollutants. And in fact, recent studies show the air quality inside the bus where the kids sit for an hour is actually about 10 times worse than the outdoor air quality. And I think when parents catch on to this, they're going to want their kids on an electric bus. So that's exciting. Most of the money for all these initiatives is coming from Ontario's new cap and trade program. That's just 1 year old in Ontario. Ontario's heading into an election, as some of you may know. Ontario's going to have an election next spring, summer. And the opposition is saying they're going to scrap cap and trade and bring in a carbon tax. And so as much as we're doing all this work to get cap and trade in place and to connect with California and Quebec in WCI, it's quite possible the whole thing will be off next year, which is pretty upsetting to all the folks who are working really hard to make this happen. But that's the reality of politics. Of course, we're still pushing ahead as if this is the way it is going to be. We're trying to hit to that 5% by 2020. We've done a lot of research. What are the barriers to getting people on board with EV? And I'm happy to talk in the Q&A after. But if you wanted to sum it up in just two main concerns or problems, it's consumer knowledge. Consumers don't know what's available. They don't know why it's beneficial. They don't know the makes and models that are available. They don't understand the prices. They don't know how much money they're going to save. They don't know anything about it, and the dealers are not helping. And range anxiety is a big psychological barrier that people have. I can tell you it's really more psychological than real. But people believe what they believe, and a lot of people will not adopt electric cars because they believe they drive too far. They believe that there's not a car that could suit their needs, even though probably there is. So that's something in terms of education we need to work on. In Ontario, we've set up the world's first EV center, which has all the makes and models of car available to test drive, has just like purely educational outfit. There's no car sales happening there, so people can come, try all the cars, and learn, and then we'll refer them to a dealer that carries the car. We find it's very effective at persuading people to switch. And we see that actually Oregon has opened something similar now called Fourth, which is exciting, and I think we'll see more and more of this around the world. Well, we don't need the commercial for that. Our sponsors, we're not for profit. You always have to thank the sponsors. We also sell charging stations, which, just to help the consumer get their home station, which is really important. I'm going to leave it at that and take your questions later. I am optimistic, despite what Normand said. I am very optimistic about the potential. It probably won't happen in the timeline that we would like, but I never dreamed, actually, even, I started Plug and Drive about 10 years ago, and I never dreamed that there would be, countries banning gas cars and automakers announcing that they're going to electrify every single make and model that they make. So it is happening. I think everyone would agree now it's not if anymore, it's just when, and of course we would like that when to be sooner. Certainly optimistic that it will happen. We need to figure out ways to help it happen more quickly, and that's really why this kind of policy discussion is very important. And I'll hand it back to Louis, and we'll take your questions when we can.
So our next speaker, we concluded the Canadian part of the night. Now we're moving south of the border, and we're going to see what's happening in a civilized country, you said, right? A developed country, right? So leaving the third world and moving to the first world. So our next speaker is Chris Bush from Climate Policy. He's the Director of Research at Energy Innovation. Sorry, I mixed that up, so I'm starting again. Chris Bush, Director of Research at Energy Innovation. He's going to talk about the climate policies in California. He leads the firm at Energy Innovation. He leads the urban sustainability and California climate policy programs. So, Chris?
Thank you very much. Great to be with you tonight. I am going to cover more of a general look at California climate policy. Julie is more of a transportation specialist, so I'm going to focus a bit more on some of the other issues. And, I agree, the challenges are real, but there's a lot of reason for optimism, I think. Despite President Trump, I think we've seen the world really coming together to not allow his reticence or hostility to the Paris Accord undermine other world efforts, and California is doing its best to sort of contribute to the North American counter-revolution, if you will, against what Trump wants to do in terms of setting back climate policy. Let's see. So what I'll be covering is sort of a look at some of the first climate policies that California put in place, look at some of the impacts we've seen so far over the last decade or so, talk about some of the more recent commitments, and a bit about what California is doing sort of to be a shadow player on the international stage in terms of letting other countries and jurisdictions know that there is action happening within the U.S. borders. So on the topic of early climate action, some of the earliest steps specifically targeted around climate took place in 2002. a renewable electricity standard was put in place at that time. That requires utilities to deliver a minimum amount of renewable electricity in their mix that they deliver to customers. And that doesn't count large hydro, by the way, only small hydro. And we'll see some statistics about that later. Some of the progress that's been made, the electricity sector is one of the most promising in terms of decarbonization options, which is why it's so important to focus on transportation. It's one of the harder challenges. But you can see here in 2006, California increased its renewable electricity standard to 20% by 2010. And in 2010, they increased it to 33% by 2020. And we are almost at that level today. And so the electricity sector is a good news story. I wanted to look a little bit at some of the impacts we've seen in terms of emissions and in terms of the economy. This is a graph of various indicators, economic and environmental. They're all pegged to the year 2000. So this is the level of these variables over the last 16 years or so. And you can see on the bottom, these are all emissions-related variables, and at the top, these are jobs and gross state product or gross domestic product at the state level. So you can see, and of course, we're in an academic setting. We should clarify and be clear that correlation is not causation. So, the economy improving on over time doesn't necessarily mean that our climate policies have caused that. But the fact is that when you try to do a sort of a backward-looking statistical evaluation of these things, there's so many moving parts that it's hard to tease out the effect of any particular policy. And so, there are no better backward-looking evaluations of the economic effects, but we can see pretty clearly that the economy is doing well, jobs are growing, and this is NOx emissions, an important contributor to ozone pollution. And so that's fallen by almost 50% since the year 2000. This is greenhouse gas emissions, down 10% from the peak in 2004, down 5% from the year 2000. You'll recall that our sort of, I think, I forgot to mention, in 2006 is when we put the framework law in place for our 2020 target, requiring a reduction to 1990 levels by 2020. So 2006 was when sort of the larger effort around climate policy was put in place. A few interesting numbers I wanted to highlight on the right here are 500,000 clean energy jobs. That's a broad definition of including energy efficiency and other sort of green jobs. And also these types of jobs have been growing much faster than other types of jobs. And so, we have this robust clean tech sector emerging, and I'll show you some stats tying more closely the rate of innovation to our policies later. But at the same time, it's important to point out that the overall economy has been performing very well. So since 2012, jobs in California have been created at a 50% faster rate than the U.S. as a whole, and economic growth in California has been twice as fast as in the rest of the country. So just wanted to spend a little time unpacking some of those trends in emissions and economics. And, I guess the big conclusion is there's been a proof that, improved environmental performance doesn't have to imply negative impacts on economic growth. And clearly, we've gone through the early stages of decarbonization and come out with a stronger economy. This is a look at renewable electricity generation in California delivered by utilities. So this doesn't count rooftop solar. This is just in the utility mix, the utility scale renewable generation. So the bottom, we have biomass, small hydro, geothermal. You can see these have been pretty stable. And then the big movers have been wind here in lavender and solar in yellow. And thanks to the growth in solar and wind, there's been a 100% increase in renewables in California over about a decade. This is the separate rooftop solar situation, and this is shows the new capacity in rooftop solar, and we're about halfway to our 12,000 megawatt goal by 2020 as of 2017. These are data for only the first half of the year, so there hasn't been a drop. This blue bar shows the increase in any particular year, and the yellow bar shows the cumulative capacity in rooftop solar. So, so this isn't showing a slowing down, it's just the first 6 months of the year. And so you can see, in addition to the utility scale solar, the great growth in the rooftop solar, or in addition to utility renewables, great growth in the utility, in the rooftop solar realm as well. Mostly leaving the transportation, Julie, but I did want to show one graph with respect to our electric vehicle trends. And so this shows a fully electric vehicle, battery electric vehicle in the light blue, and the lavender are plug-in hybrids that mostly are electric drive. And so these are increasing pretty robustly as well. Although, you know, the drop-off in gas prices has put something of a damper on the trends. Although in the first quarter of 2017, we did have 5% of electric vehicles in California were battery electric or plug-in hybrids. Quick look at some investment. This is clean tech investment in California versus the U.S. as a whole, and you can see that California is attracting or capturing almost 3/4 of all clean tech investment in the U.S. Also, in terms of patents, another sort of indicator of innovation activity, you can see I've put a line here showing representing the population of California, which is about 12% of the U.S., which helps sort of show how in all these different particular technologies, California-based companies are far outperforming what you would expect based on our population. So, you know, almost 40% of solar patents filed by California-based companies. You know, energy efficiency and energy storage both above 25% of all patents being filed by California companies. Some other observations about recent commitments, new laws put in place in the last few years. In 2015, a new law passed requiring 50% renewable electricity by 2030. There was a 100% by 2045 bill debated this year. It didn't quite pass, but this Senate Bill 350 also requires the Energy Commission to get policies in place to double the pace of energy efficiency improvement in existing buildings. New buildings are easier to handle through new building standards, but existing buildings have been more difficult to target with policy. Just this past summer, a new bill passed extending the state's authority for the state's cap and trade program to 2030. So here you can see Arnold Schwarzenegger. He signed the original cap and AB 32 bill in 2006, and here's the governor. This was passed by a 2/3 majority because the sale of these carbon allowances at auction is deemed, well, under our law, it had to pass by a 2/3 majority. And so far as I know, there's never been a vote in favor of carbon pricing at that level of approval, either in a legislature or a direct ballot. So that was quite an accomplishment, even though I had made a mental note to not pretend that California does everything right or doesn't have anything to learn from other people or anything like that. So I should say that I do feel like our cap and trade program, and maybe we can get into this in the discussion if there's interest, is is in need of some reforms in order to do the job it's going to be asked to do in the coming years. And this is a picture similar to the picture we saw regarding Quebec's future policies. This was a law, SB 32, which was passed in 2016, sort of updating our economy-wide commitments beyond. You can see this is the 2020 target, as I mentioned, required the state to get back to 1990 levels, 430 million metric tons. This shows statewide emissions in California. And so the new law put the force of law behind this goal, which is a 40% reduction in a short 10 years. So that's going to be a heavy lift, quite an aggressive target. And, but I'm confident, thanks to collaboration with good folks in other places, we can get there. I just wanted to highlight a little bit of what California is doing outside of our borders. This is a picture of Governor Brown with President Xi in China. There are many links between China and California, and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, run by UC Berkeley, has a China Energy Group, which has worked for many years with China regulators, putting in place building codes and appliance standards, and they're working on a zero-emission vehicle standard in China that is inspired and informed by what California has been doing. After Trump pulled the U.S., or it's not clear what he did. We don't have the authority to pull out until 2020. He says they want to renegotiate, whatever. He was throwing cold water on Paris, and so there's been a backlash by many other governors, mayors, etc. And and some of that comes under this America's Pledge, where there's a whole group of leaders trying to put in place the steps that are needed to essentially meet the U.S. commitment under Paris through other means, even though that, frankly, will be challenging. But there's an effort underway, and there's a lot of activity around that. Externally, he has worked on the Under 2 MOU agreement, which is an effort to get other subnationals, as they're called, provinces, states, cities, to commit to targets in line with the 2 degrees Celsius target that the scientists say we need to avoid the global temperature rising above if we're going to have a reasonable chance of avoiding dangerous climate change. And then, partly as a recognition of everything Governor Brown's been doing for the upcoming talks in Bonn of the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC, he's going to be he was named a special envoy for states and cities, and so he's really doing a lot to travel and try to encourage other places to undertake the mantle of action as well. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We're going to stay in California. Next speaker is Julie Whitcover. She's an assistant project scientist at the Institute of Transportation Studies and Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy at University of California, Davis. So without further introduction, Julie.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here and continue the discussion a little bit on California and transportation within the climate policy. This is another version of a by now familiar graph about the importance of transportation to emissions. It's true in California also. But I also want to note that if you look back upstream from the tailpipe emissions to what's going on in refineries and oil extraction in California, you actually also get quite a bit, about half of that industrial piece of the pie. So depending on how you think about transportation emissions, it's even bigger. And I think this has already also been alluded to. Some people ask, why focus on transportation? Why is it a special case? Well, it's not just greenhouse gas emissions, but there are these other emissions from nitrous oxide and particulate matter that have health quality implications that are becoming increasingly important. So these policies or these targets are also becoming major drivers of change in the transportation sector. In addition, the argument is, and California is definitely going in this direction, that you have to focus on transportation to have change because there's something different about the sector. It's a little more resistant to change because you have vehicle fleet turnover, which takes some time. If you're going to have new vehicles types, you have a different distribution infrastructure. These kinds of investments will take time. And if you look at the targets and then back up from there, it would argue for starting now. Okay, so this is a topic of some discussion, but California is moving with a focus on transportation. Now they have a suite of policies and policy targets within transportation also. One focus is on vehicle miles traveled. Can you get people to travel less? And there are sustainable community strategies and land use planning. The consensus is what's going on there so far isn't enough, and it also is very difficult to model, so it's hard to know what exactly is happening. The other targets are vehicles and fuels. So there's sort of three main targets. And the latest scoping plan, which is the targets for 2030, estimate that about 27 to 32% of those reductions would be coming from the transportation sector, driven by the vehicles and the fuels. I have little asterisks there because I'm going to focus on them for this presentation, and the fuels is really more of my research focus. Okay, so this is another version of what Chris showed, and California really wants to move towards a zero-emission fleet. The graphic is for passenger vehicles and light trucks, the light-duty sector. And what you see really is by 2050, trying to move to something like 66% of the fleet as being plug-in hybrid electric, battery electric, or fuel cell and hydrogen. And so the internal combustion engine would be being phased out. And as has been mentioned, you need a big bump in sales to then have a lagged effect on the vehicle fleet. So this means a lot of action soon. The impetus is also moving towards the heavy-duty fleet to electrify as much of that as possible, because with the diesel in that sector, it's also driving some of the other pollution issues that we have. But behind all the electrification, you have to think, how is that electricity being made? What are the carbon implications there? And California, as Chris mentioned, is moving very strongly in that direction. But you always have to think with the electrification, are you getting the renewable fuels making the electricity, or are you just moving the carbon elsewhere? And this will likely require substantial incentives. Maybe Navigant is right, and it'll just take off. But California seems to be planning for pushing on the incentive side as needed. Okay, I'm going to discuss the fuels a little bit more. California takes a life cycle approach to carbon emissions with fuels, and that means not looking just at the tailpipe emissions, but as I was alluding to before, backing up to how is the fuel made. Okay, so in this little diagram, if you kind of start on the right and move counterclockwise to the left, it sort of walks you through the different parts of the life cycle. You have raw materials, you have to transport it somewhere, you have to have conversion technology to make the fuel. That has to go somewhere where it's distributed for use in vehicle. All of those steps have carbon emissions associated with them. And what California does is basically add up all those emissions and then look per unit of energy, per unit of on-road energy, and rate fuels according to that life cycle carbon intensity. There are some adjustments that are made. Corn ethanol, for example, also produces something called dried distilled grains and solubles, which can be used as an animal feed. So if you think about that going back into the feed sector where the corn came from to make the ethanol, there's a carbon benefit there, right? So you don't have to replace all of that carbon all that corn that has come out to go into the biofuel. But there are also concerns about the land use effects of this. If you take too much crop away, where the corn demand is still there, and so you need to fill in some way for at least part of that. And some of those activities will have carbon emissions. So California is trying to account for all of these in some way. And they're applying it to on-road fuels, electric rail and forklift, and just proposing moving into the aviation sector. But these are not hard and fast numbers, especially the indirect effects. They're estimates, and they vary, and there's some uncertainties. So there are difficulties in moving from the assessment to the application of the policy. So this is a little graphic about, this shows the compliance curve for the low carbon fuel standard. It's in percentage terms on the right and in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule, which is the metric of carbon intensity on the right. And it's showing that basically the goal is to get the whole fuel pool to reduce its carbon intensity by 10% in 2020. And now the proposal is by 18% in 2030. And the way it works is that life cycle analysis I just showed you, if your score comes out above the target for that year, you have a deficit associated with that volume of fuel. If it comes out below, you get a credit. Okay? And then there's trading. It's a market trading system, market mechanism. And you have to have enough credits to cover the deficits, and then you've met the standard. Okay? So it's a revenue neutral market mechanism, because what it does is it basically puts a penalty on a high carbon fuel, and then that money gets transferred because you're buying credits from the people who produce the low carbon fuel. So the government doesn't actually touch that money, it gets transferred in order to hit the targets. Now it's meant to be technology forcing, get new technologies, because it's so stringent to say, well, in order to get a 10% reduction or an 18% reduction, we're obviously going to need new technologies. But that's really an empirical question, because the thing, you get credit for carbon, squeezing carbon out anywhere in the supply chain. So how much carbon can we get out of corn ethanol production the way it is, or the way that biodiesel is made? This policy is meant to kind of reveal that, okay? And it's also meant to be technology neutral. You can get credit for corn ethanol. You can get credit for soy biodiesel. It all depends on the carbon rating, okay? So what has happened under the LCFS, Low Carbon Fuel Standard in California? Some people would say this is dramatic, and some people would say it isn't. You don't see a lot of cellulosic ethanol. You don't see any cellulosic ethanol, which was going to be the big savior in terms of a new fuel. But you do see still a lot of ethanol, but you have different kinds of ethanol. You have corn ethanol that's getting savings using natural gas and other changes in the process. You have switches to other feedstocks, sorghum and wheat residue in order to lower the carbon intensity. And then you have a very sizable increase of biomass-based diesel coming into the system. The same was true in the US as a whole, because there were credits for that, but it's even more true in California. And you really see this fairly dramatic increase in percentage, that's the green line, the green dotted line, in biomass-based diesel by volume. And in fact, most of the compliance for the low carbon fuel standard has come on the diesel side, whereas people a priori before the policy really was implemented were expecting the cellulosic ethanol or something would happen on the gasoline side. And now you also have electrification showing up. You've got biogas, you've got natural gas, so you have a diversifying fuel mix. And I just want to say also that the thought is that even if we do a lot of electrification, there's some modes of transport, heavy duty and aviation, that really require, or so far require, hydrocarbons. So the thought is that you're still going to need to know how to make biofuels, make them in a low carbon way, in order to really get to the low carbon economy that we're thinking we're going to need towards the end of the century. And there are concerns about whether the land base can give us enough of those biofuels even with all the electrification. So I was mentioning that indirect land use change, how they account for corn diverted and what it might be happening to the land. Well, the modeling that they used to look at that was revised, updated in 2016. And what this graphic just shows is that that change lowered those estimates. And I just wanted to show what the market response, it's not necessarily a market response only to this, but the trend had been away from crop-based biofuels up until that point, and then that trend reversed a little bit in 2016. That's a one-time change with this particular revision. But just to show that the market is responding, or it appears to be responding to this, taking into account that land use effects could exist. This graphic is straight from ARB's, the Air Resources Board, which implements the program, their data dashboard. And there's a lot of interest in this kind of thing. How much of the biofuel production is happening in state? Well, it's been pretty steady. And there's kind of a misconception sometimes because it's a state policy, and a lot of state policy is targeted towards jobs. But the low carbon fuel standard really is focusing on the carbon intensity rating. And while if you make a fuel in California, you're going to have less carbon to transport it to the fuel market in California, it's not really doing, it's not entering, it's not bringing location into it in any other way. So it's location agnostic, really. And there are other programs in California that may incentivize production in state. So I just wanted to make sure I made that point. And that's all I had. I look forward to discussion later.
Thank you, Julie. Last but not least, we're getting a bit closer to home with Jennifer Wallace-Brother from Vermont. She's the Director of Transportation Efficiency at Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. Julie? Jennifer?
Thank you so much. And it's interesting to be in this group because Vermont is such a different jurisdiction than what you've been hearing from so far. So hopefully this will add a little different perspective from a state that is pretty small, relatively rural, relatively low income, but probably a lot like a lot of states in the US. So I'll get started here. First, I'd like to just say I am the Transportation Efficiency Director at the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. We're a mission-driven nonprofit working to reduce the environmental and economic impact of energy use, and my group is focused on the transportation sector. And I was going to give you, I'd like to give you a little bit of context on the legislation in Vermont and policy and planning. So in 2006, Vermont passed legislation with greenhouse gas reduction goals to curb greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2028. Not quite sure why they picked that date. Seems a little weird, but there it is. And 75% by 2050, although it had this little to the extent possible clause. So not super encouraging there. More recently, in 2015, the state adopted a renewable energy standard, which included a provision that requires utilities to engage in energy transformation projects to reduce fossil fuel consumption among their customers. This has actually been a really interesting piece of legislation. Utilities are required to reduce the equivalent of 2% of their utility retail sales in 2017, rising to 12% in 2032, and they can engage in transportation or home heating and cooling projects. This provision has actually spurred some interesting utility engagement in transportation projects, mainly electric vehicle incentives being offered by some of our utilities. Our state's largest municipal utility in Burlington is offering a transit bus incentive. They're also offering consumer incentives for EV purchase and including an adder if you're low income. And our largest state utility, IOU, just actually announced that they're going to do a small incentive for their low-income customers. So the state also has adopted a comprehensive energy plan. It has actually not been adopted by the legislature. Development of the plan was led by our public service department with a lot of input from other state agencies, non-government organizations, and the public. I would argue that this has actually been a more influential plan in terms of motivating advocates, government, and others to really dig in on energy issues in the state of Vermont. And it's sort of the guiding star for those of us who are working on transportation and trying to shift focus to the transportation sector in the state of Vermont. I'd also like to note that Jonathan Dowds from UVM, University of Vermont actually tracks metrics related to the transportation sector through the Vermont Transportation Energy Profile. They do that in partnership with our Vermont Agency of Transportation. So they've identified a bunch of metrics to help us meet, to monitor progress towards these goals and report on that, I think, every couple of years. So we're going to get a new one soon, actually, and we're really looking forward to that. Here's the same pie chart. Everybody has a pie chart that looks the same. But transportation has been the largest emitting sector in Vermont for quite a while. So no big news there, like everybody else. Also, it's quite clear that if we don't actually begin to really make progress, we're not going to meet our goals, our 2028 goal. So that's the gray stars where we were supposed to be by 2012, and we're certainly not there, but we absolutely have a long way to go in the state of Vermont. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that we are working in a context that, as I mentioned, is rural, that is relatively low income, and we have a governor who has got sort of a 3 pillars of his platform, and one of them is affordability, another is policies that address the most vulnerable. So the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, my team actually did this analysis to really highlight the impact on household budgets of transportation spending. So if you look on the left, that's the red indicates pockets of high spending on transportation, household spending, and the one on the right is actually spending as a percentage of median income. This has been quite helpful for us to actually articulate the problem from a human perspective, that people are spending a lot of their household budget on transportation, and we need to do something about it. So if people aren't motivated by climate, and I know all of us are, but sometimes more people care about what they're spending, and policymakers are often persuaded by the fact that people need some relief for things they can't necessarily control well in their household budgets. So, and then the other thing I wanted to mention is health is also a really important factor in Vermont. We're actually one of the healthiest states in the country if you look at sort of the different, surveys and stuff that come out. Most of the work has been, and I think this is true across the country, on active transportation, which is one strategy that is needed to begin to bend the curve on transportation energy use. But I think air pollution has not been quite as compelling. Active transportation has been really linked to our obesity, rates of obesity, and so there's a lot of focus on biking and walking. But I think air pollution is also a really important issue, and I think that's something that we should be talking about more in this context. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the strategies we're pursuing that tie up to our comprehensive energy plan. So the first thing is really more efficient vehicles. Vermont is what's called a zero emission state, meaning we've signed an MOU with several other states to help accelerate the EV market in Vermont. Really started with California, so thank you very much. One way we do that is through a Drive Electric Vermont program, much like was described for Ontario. We actually administer that program. We do outreach and education. We have done a lot of work with deployment of public infrastructure, and we've done a couple of rounds of EV incentive programs. We do not have a state-funded EV incentive program, so the money we have had has come from a nonprofit. And we don't have any money for that anymore, so it's great that some of the utilities are stepping into that space. But this effort, this Drive Electric Vermont effort, has really paid off. So Vermont has the highest per capita EV registrations and public charging stations in the country. And since the program started, we have seen an increase every quarter in EV adoption rates in the state. I've got to keep myself going here. The other thing I wanted to just mention is that we have had some utility investments in EV public charging that has gotten us a long way, and that was primarily done by Green Mountain Power. They've stopped investing because the market really hasn't caught up with what they've installed. So this is a sort of chicken and egg issue that is prevalent around the country, that when utilities make investments in charging, they want to see them being used, and these weren't being used as much as they should be, so hopefully we will get beyond that. With that said, the state of Vermont is working on a plan to fill key gaps for DC fast charging in the state of Vermont, so that all Vermonters will be within 30 miles of a public fast charger. And we're hoping that that plan will be put out by the end of this year. And last but not least, this is a Lion bus, which is manufactured just north of here in Montreal. Yay! We've actually been working very closely with them, and we're part of a demonstration in Massachusetts. We're leading a demonstration in 3 school districts of electric transit buses. It's the first Type C, which is your typical yellow bus. Deployment in the U.S. of ready-built technology that Lion does. And Lion is the manufacturer, and that's providing the buses in that jurisdiction. And it's a really exciting project. We think that there's great opportunity in the heavy-duty space with buses. It's kind of a great combination of public transportation and more efficient vehicles coming together. So you really get a great bang for your buck when you invest in buses. I'll talk a little bit about our comprehensive energy plan. Includes strategies related to land use and trying to focus more on mixed-use development, compact land use. I also included that Vermont has passed a complete streets policy, which requires that the needs of all road users are considered for new road projects and when roads are being fixed or repaired, or that there are maintenance upgrades on them. This is a policy that's been really proliferating across the country, and it's great because it's changing the mindset of traffic engineers away from try to move as many cars as fast as possible on the road to we need to think about this as public space that all users should be able to access safely. And so it's been a really important development in the country, I think, and Vermont has that policy on the books. Vermont's a really sparsely populated state, so some of the really cool things that are happening, like Uber and Lyft and ride-hailing and ride-sharing, is pretty challenging, and it's probably going to be a while before we see that proliferating around the state. With that said, our state department our Agency of Transportation does invest very heavily in public transit, which has been essential to building out a fixed route system that pretty much serves most of the state of Vermont, either through buses or volunteer drivers. So that's a really critical thing for states to actually invest in public transportation. Not all states do. I think the other thing, our Agency of Transportation is also working on a grant that they got from the Federal Transit Administration where they're trying to make more efficient use of the vehicles that they're putting on the road to provide rides. So they're trying to develop an app so that if they're providing a ride for somebody to the doctor, that somebody else could find out about it. They get another person in the car, which makes that ride more efficient for their investment, and it also provides more options for people who need a ride. I'm almost done, so we can get to the cocktails. What's coming? We are paying very close attention to the Volkswagen settlement. Volkswagen cheated, which we all know, and now they're paying. And states are getting varying allocations depending on how many vehicles were sold in their states. In Vermont, we're getting about $18.7 million as a result of the settlement, which is fairly significant for a state our size. And we're really hoping that the state will develop a plan that will invest in electric vehicle technology, particularly school buses and transit buses. And following the conversation with colleagues around the country, buses do seem to be a favored technology for advocates, and electrification is also something that a lot of advocates are pushing for. It's a pot of money that isn't coming out of anybody's pocket except for Volkswagen, so it's kind of an awesome opportunity to get the ball rolling on some of this electrification. The other thing that we've been sort of debating in Vermont for a little while is carbon pricing. Energy Independent Vermont is a campaign to pass a carbon tax. It has gotten traction, I think, among the public, some members of the public, but policymakers have been pretty scared by it. It has become an issue in the last two gubernatorial campaigns with candidates saying they would not support a carbon tax. Republicans have pretty much beat up Democrats pretty soundly on any attempts to impose a carbon tax. So I'm not quite sure what the prognosis is. I think there's going to be another round of debate about this in the legislature, although our governor has said already he would not support a carbon tax. I think Vermont is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap-and-trade program for the electric sector. It's a real success story. And so there's beginning to be conversation about how that program could be expanded to the transportation sector. We're part of a group of advocates that are trying to encourage our state leaders to get involved in that conversation. And the Georgetown Climate Center is convening state officials through a transportation climate initiative, and is really, I think, trying to set the table for that conversation to happen in the region. And then every once in a while, somebody will say, well, why don't we just join the Western Climate Initiative? So I don't think that that's really realistic at this point, but you know, people do talk about it from time to time. I do think that probably, you know, if I was to read the tea leaves, I think something like Reggie is going to be a little bit easier to swallow for politicians than the carbon tax, but you never know. And then speaking of politicians, there's Phil Scott in the middle, who's our Republican governor. He was elected in November. As I said, he does not support a carbon tax, but he has distanced himself pretty significantly from President Trump on climate issues. He did, in response to the Paris withdrawal, or whatever it is, he signed on to the We're Still in the Climate Pledge Coalition, and he's announced a Climate Action Commission this summer that is charged with sending specific actionable items to his desk by January. And a lot of us are really focusing on trying to bring transportation-focused ideas to the Climate Commission to recommend to the governor. So all to say, stay tuned. Maybe the little state south of Quebec will actually pull through with some exciting policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I don't want to disappoint you, Jennifer, but it's not the cocktail yet. We had the Q&A session before. So I would ask the presenters to come and take a seat in the front row. So pour ceux qui ont des questions, je vous demanderai de vous lever, je vous passerai le microphone. On a un petit enjeu de technologie. Nous n'avons que 2 microphones, donc il y aura un microphone pour nos panélistes et un microphone que je déplacerai dans la salle. Je vous demanderai aussi de vous identifier avant de poser votre question et de peut-être diriger votre question à un des panélistes ou d'aller sur une question générale. So you have the button. This is the button, so wait to have the button before talking. So is there already a question? Otherwise, I can start with one. Well, we all saw great pie charts. All of them were quite similar, where transportation was the biggest part of the chart. And it looks to me that most of the effort are done at replacing fuel, either by electrifying cars or low carbon fuels. But if there would be an additional measure or initiative that should be brought forward to further reduce the amount of energy consumed in the transportation sector, what do you think it should be? So if you could add something in addition to replacing fuel in the transportation sector, what would it be?
I guess, I mean, right now, there's a lot of focus on the shared mobility also in California. And I think shared mobility, electrification, and automation, all of them. But there's a lot of unknown about it. So I'm a little hesitant to say I would push it yet because we just don't really know what the effect of those transformations singly and jointly will be on the transportation sector. But I think that that's a promising direction that could move very quickly and in surprising ways and open up new areas for policy.
I have to say that in a long-term vision that a lot of people feel like land use is one of the main culprits in why we need to drive as much as we do. And so it's not an immediate, like tomorrow we're going to suddenly all live in communities close to the things we need to do. But I think that the more that we can get back to denser, more compact communities that have the amenities that we need nearby that you can walk to or bike to, that can support transit and shared rides is a long-term future. And I know that in my state, it is also something that's deeply tied to the ethic of the state, where we've really been trying to struggle against sprawl and development that is spreading into farmland and other places that make the state special. So I think that it is also often really tied to the values of communities. So that's another thought.
So indeed, it's a question of reducing the use of individual car transportation. So there's active transportation, and there's of course very different questions when you are in a dense environment like in a city like Montreal, where there you have to push active transportation. A lot of people use the car for distances of less than 1.5, for displacement of less than 1.5 kilometers that they could do by foot or by bicycle very easy, public transportation. And when you move outside of these cities in less dense, then the sharing becomes, I mean, essentially if you want to keep people in their house in the low density region, you have to offer service and sharing, but also having better public transportation between the cities, between the villages. Then all you have to care is for the last, it's no longer a last mile, but last 5 miles or something. So that's a different story. You need to offer this to keep people also in the regions, because there's a question of depopulating people. If you push too hard on getting cars off the road in these regions, you depopulate, you move people back in larger centers. That's not an issue for the larger occupation of the territory problem.
Few thoughts for you would be, California has methane emission standards from oil and gas extraction, so oftentimes natural gas and oil are mixed together, and so reducing the methane emissions associated with sort of the upstream oil production is part of it. I would mention California is spending cap and trade money. We've heard lots of different investment options, but they're developing EV car sharing programs specifically targeted at low-income communities, and so there's a big emphasis in California in making sure the benefits of electrification and low-carbon transportation are well spread. Another example in that area would be sort of incentives for people to retire or turn in their older, less efficient vehicles to get more efficient vehicles. Even if they're not electric vehicles, they can make a big difference. Regular car standards, fuel economy standards for regular cars is a big part of the answer as well. So those are a few other thoughts I had.
Yeah, urban sprawl is a huge issue in the Greater Toronto area, and they've built large communities in the suburbs where there is nothing you can walk to. You're basically forced into a car, and so urban planning obviously has to play a big part. Another, transportation is the largest emitting sector, but second in Ontario is buildings. We have a huge stock of old apartment buildings built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and those buildings are ripe for improvements, big reductions possible from those old buildings. And actually, Ontario is also introducing a scrappage program to try to encourage people to retire old vehicles, even if they're going to buy a gas vehicle. There's a huge step improvement from a very old gas car to a new gas car. And of course, they get like an added bonus if they would choose electric when they scrap a gas car. So that's another opportunity.
Thank you. Any question from the audience? Yeah.
Hey. I would like to ask if you know how transportation data is calculated on a national level or federal level. I know it's quite difficult. And if usually it includes ship and air transport. And I also would like to ask if you consider nuclear energy a clean and renewable source. Thanks.
I heard the nuclear and ships. What was the first thing?
How transportation data is calculated on your
Greenhouse gas emissions and transportation?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think it's not your. I don't know if you.
Yeah, it's pretty easy with transportation fuels to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions versus some of the local air pollutants. Because essentially, whereas the local air pollutants, it depends a lot more on how well maintained your car is and how your catalytic converter is and the like. But so basically they just look at the amount of fuel being sold and they can calculate when it's burned how much carbon dioxide is emitted on the data side. The nuclear question is a hotly debated one. I would just say it's always turned out to be more expensive than forecasted, and with the price of renewables and solar and wind in particular dropping down to essentially cost parity with fossil fuels, I don't see why we need nuclear. But if someone can find a cheap, safe nuclear plant, then I'm not ideologically opposed.
I agree if you're talking about a situation where nuclear hasn't been built. But in Ontario, for example, we have a lot of nuclear already built. It exists, it's running, it's very low carbon emitting. So I would say, I would say use it until it's at the end of its useful life. But once you get to that point, I certainly agree that there's, at least by then and even now, there's probably options that are more affordable and also zero emitting from a carbon point of view. So I wouldn't think that we would renew it at that point. But for now, it's what we've got.
And in the case of the life cycle analysis, I mean, when the policy started, they had kind of typical pathways that they thought captured the processes for making these fuels. But then regulated parties could also say, well, I'm doing it a better way. And the policy is really moving towards having individual calculations at facility level and taking the whole pathway to California. So that's been an evolution of the policy, and there are some parts of the process that are becoming a little less, a little more inertia in terms of being able to change it, but it's really moving towards the ability to change the value at your specific facility for any place along the production chain, except agriculture. Agriculture is still sticky.
So in Vermont, we closed our nuclear plant, I don't know how many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And it was pretty cheap source of power, but it wasn't safe, and they couldn't prove it was safe. They kept having accidents and made people pretty nervous. So all I can say is that there's been a couple, I think, of moments where discussion about power source has really sparked a better discussion about what we need to do in the future. The first one was in Burlington, Vermont, when Hydro-Quebec was first built, and the municipal utility was going to buy power from Hydro-Quebec. There was a vote in the city, and the voters turned it down, in part because of some of the issues with the Cree and others in northern Quebec. And I think our attitudes have changed a lot about Hydro-Quebec, but at the time, what it did was spark a real conversation about energy efficiency as an alternative. And there was a very big investment in the city in energy efficiency, and now there's a very large statewide energy efficiency program. With Vermont Yankee, I don't think it's the reason that we've focused a lot on renewables in Vermont, but I do think that it's been part of the conversation. And so I think every time that we have this conversation, I think we get to a better place, which is what can we do instead of that? And so that would be my commentary on it.
I'll get to you. The point of oil is important, in fact, in transportation, because in most places, if you follow the Kyoto, the way we're supposed to account for the UN, we count only the emissions done in the jurisdiction. So if we buy the oil from somewhere, the refinery somewhere else, essentially it's not counted in the emissions related to transportation. So we don't use life cycle analysis in general for all these inventory. So California does it, but as a different accounting than, say, for the carbon market. So the numbers you see are the low mark, because we don't include all the emissions done at the production, at the transportation of the product itself, and at the refinery level.
So I'll just be real brief. Just maybe one issue to nuance is not necessarily the calculations of emissions, but also the administration of the emission reductions. And there's been, often it's been perceived that the carbon tax is much simpler to administer. You just put the carbon tax in place, and then you get the emission reductions, and that there'd be concern about replicating that administrative efficiency with a cap and trade program. So just to be clear, what's happening in Quebec and California, and I guess Ontario as well, is they put a cap is applied just to the distributors of oil and gas in each jurisdiction, and then they are responsible for passing the price on to consumers. And just a final note on nuclear power. I know it's quite out of favor in the developed world, but in my experience, the most recent case of interest in a new nuclear power plant is in Kenya, which has a contract with a South Korean firm to build a nuclear power plant there by 2022. So just throwing that out there to expand our horizons. Oh, hold on.
Thank you. Any another question from the audience? No, but we do have a question for our Facebook streaming audience. What have governments done to curb the sale of large vehicles in any of your jurisdiction? And it would add as a sub-question, if they have done something, what is it? And if they haven't done anything, why?
So in Quebec, there is a surtax for the large vehicle. It's not very important, but also in immatriculation. So when you renew your immatriculation, you pay as a function of the size of the engine, the motor. But it's not very large, so it doesn't impact a lot. There's been a lot of debate about should there be a malus bonus or kind of a penalty on cars that emit a lot, and transfer this money to cars that don't emit much. And there's a debate because it's been done somewhere other places, and what happens often is that when you do this, you increase the sale of cars, overall cars, because you facilitate access for people who would buy who have less money. So in a place like Quebec, where we don't produce any car, the resulting factor of these type of approaches might be to sell more cars and to get more money outside of the economy. So it might be good for greenhouse gas, but it might not be good for the global economy of the province. So that's a bit tricky. So in some way, the EV approach, where we say, okay, we have to sell more electric vehicle, it's a way of doing this, because to sell more EV, you have to subsidize this, and you have to take this from other vehicles, which will be more emitting. So that's one way of letting the car industry handling this and not meddling. Because where it's done, in the end, it's often there's more interest for the cheaper cars, the lower cars, and then the money from the expensive car doesn't cover, so by the time you correct, the government has to put some money on the table. So it's not so easy to balance if you do it like this, if you don't want to tax simply the higher cars.
I don't think we have anything that taxes big cars. But that said, our legislature for the last 2 years has tried to impose an EV registration fee because electric vehicles don't contribute to gas tax in our state or anywhere. So, and they have perennial issues with the transportation fund, really mostly because of CAFE standards in the US and cars are getting more efficient. And so gas tax revenue is going down. I don't think the 2,000 EVs, an extra $50 registration fee is really going to solve that problem, but I think it goes to a deeper resentment that some people aren't paying their fair share. So we're trying to figure out the strategy on that, and one thing we're thinking, well, maybe we can capitulate on that, but get them to also raise a tax on the highest, the least fuel efficient cars as well, to try to have a more sane policy on it, but well, TBD, I guess.
Yeah, I'm Chris may know more, but I'm thinking, it's sort of baked into the economy standards, a little bit with the low carbon fuel standard, but not within ICE vehicles, because the low carbon fuel standard does basically an on-road megajoule. So, for example, the carbon intensity of electricity doesn't look so great just on a per megajoule basis, but when you adjust for the efficiency of the drivetrain, then it looks very attractive. So, in that sense, efficiency is being rewarded, but that doesn't happen within the ICE space. It's really more about what the general economy standards are.
Yeah, well, we use ICE, and of course, if a gas car parks in front of a charging station, we call it getting iced. So, and you are, frozen out of that spot. In Ontario, we also there is a very minuscule tax on high-emitting vehicles. It doesn't make a significant difference. There is a program that's just been out for comment called the Green Commercial Fleet Program, and so it's not in place. It was out for public comment, and now they're looking at the comments, and it will provide incentives for fleets to to make changes, including some heavy duty, going to LNG from diesel, going to putting batteries into refrigeration vehicles and some other heavy duty items. So I guess there's a little bit of effort on bigger vehicles, but that's all I know about in Ontario.
I mean, California has a lot in the freight space, but that not really expecting those vehicles to go away, but trying to make them more efficient.
Thank you. Question up there.
So, as mentioned, Ontario has some of the most generous EV subsidies, but the Toronto Transit Commission is one of the least subsidized, government-subsidized transit systems in North America. So user fares pay for a great majority of the system. How much do you think that has to do with the auto lobby in Ontario?
I don't know the answer.
Loaded political question.
I really don't know the answer to that. I do know there's a new initiative. It's actually Canada-wide. It's called QTRIC. It's a mouthful, Canadian Urban Transit Research Consortium. Anyway, it is looking at really reducing emissions from transit, and I know the TTC is part of it, which is the Toronto Transit Commission. Also Go Transit, and I know the Montreal Transit is part of it. And they're all looking at sort of combining resources to do big research projects, because some of these important research trials can't be done by one transit authority alone, and most of them don't have R&D budgets. And so by pooling resources, like they're doing a pan-Canadian electric bus trial, and by putting all their resources together, they can deploy try something in Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, and they're all sharing information. So that's a step in the right direction. It doesn't really address this problem of underfunding of the TTC, but certainly there's people trying to be creative and figure out ways around that.
Thank you. Other questions?
Maybe to jump on that last question, some of you mentioned the EV subsidies. So as a government expenditures, what's the biggest bang for the buck? And if it's not towards reducing greenhouse gases emissions, if it's not EV subsidies, maybe it's transit or something else.
It depends where you are. That's clearly, it depends if you have a car industry or not, for example, in your state or a province, and that affects. Again, if you think of Quebec, for example, we don't produce any car. Every car that we buy comes from outside. So subsidizing electric car, even though we have clean electricity, might not be the best way to transform transportation and keep the money inside to do economic development at the same time. So supporting public transportation, for example, or even light active electric vehicles that we would produce here and that we could move cars off the road with this could be a better solution. It's difficult to tell because there's no studies. Essentially, all these decisions have been taken without any study of what are the gains on this and what we could do else with this money. So we spend $80 million on subsidizing electric cars, but it's really not clear. I mean, to me, it's not a good idea. We could have taken this 80 million and have a better transition in the transportation sector here in lowering the emissions, but I don't have data, I don't have a study to show that either.
I saw a study recently, and I just can't think where it came out of. But and I'm not an expert on which gets you the biggest bang for the buck. But what I saw was like the number 1 and number 2 things to reduce emissions: eat less meat. Number 2, and number 1 was have less children. Which I thought is like, well, everyone can do it, right? I mean, it doesn't cost anything. So anyway, so apparently those are the largest. If you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, just you provide a lot of education on reducing number of children and help people understand that they need to eat less meat.
Is there a retrofit market for that?
You save all those trips taking the kids to...
Exactly, a lot more transportation with more children.
Yeah, I don't think we have the information to know. That's really the subject of debate is where you invest when. But I have seen a lot of critiques about the EV incentives the way they are. Like they don't always come out at the dealership and they're too invisible for the consumer. That a lot of the EV owners, the early adopters, are very wealthy, and it's the monetary incentives aren't as important as the HOV lane access or the high occupancy, the special lane access and parking and other perks. And also that if you try to do a kind of a social cost of carbon benefit based on the electricity grid and looking at the particulate matter and other benefits, highly uncertain, but that it may not always add up to as much as going out in the incentives. So as you're saying, we're just sort of bringing that into the research fold of if you're going to incentivize how and try to get a feel for the responses to what's out there now.
Just while you're picking up, I mean, we have a few more experts in the room, so if you have something to say, you should not hesitate to raise your hand. I think you should be part of the panel.
I wanted to agree with Julie that I think there's a lot of really interesting questions around how to best design the subsidies to make them more optimally effective, and some of the issues she raised are really top tier. One interesting idea that I've been we've been playing around in our organization is the idea of sort of asking manufacturers to bid into a sort of what you would call a reverse auction on the lowest amount of subsidy that they would need to sell cars, and they would only get the subsidy if they actually sell the car, and there would be a penalty if some small penalty to make them not just bid low to mess up the system. But in that way, they're sort of uniquely, they know the consumers the best, so they might know, and also there's been a problem of the manufacturers and the dealers not being as enthusiastic as they might be, so it would sort of be another tool to bring them on. I did, in terms of like across the transportation options, I did want to offer an opinion that while I love the smart growth and the urban design and compact walkable neighborhoods that are better served by transit, I think in the analysis in California it's been shown, because those patterns change much more slowly, we're only building 1% new buildings a year of the building stock or something, and the vehicles turn over much faster. The EV transition has much bigger reductions more quickly. But I think the urban innovation and improvement ideas are so important as well, and are in demand for people and have quality of life benefits. I'm not trying to dismiss those, but I think the EV and efficient vehicles have to be sort of given proper rank at probably the top of the heap.
So another point that you hear is that a lot of the electric vehicles are coming into the market to satisfy a policy, and it's about getting that many vehicles into the market, not necessarily more. And as you point out, there are people around who know how to reach the consumer base effectively. And I think once there's more buzz, there's more interest, the cost effectiveness takes off, and the manufacturers start to see the value proposition in a different way, then without government incentives and figuring out how to reach the consumer, those actors know how to do that already.
Thank you.
My question is more about the battery used in EV cars. We know that right now big players like Tesla, they use a lot of battery with lithium, and we know that lithium is not an infinite resource. And do you think they have a rooftop for adoption of electric cars?
So that's a good question about lithium and whether there's a maximum sort of number of cars we could possibly make, and there are other metals as well where that can be an issue. My understanding is actually there have been new supplies of lithium found, and that it's not going to be a limiting factor. Also, it can be reused indefinitely. Because the cars are so new, you don't see a lot of recycling of these batteries yet, but you will see it. And my understanding is that most of the lithium can be reused. And in fact, actually, what's going to happen is you're going to see reuse of the battery in a secondary use, and then recycling of the battery after that. And so I think that issue will get dealt with, but as I say, the cars are 6-7 years old, so we aren't seeing a lot of used batteries coming out yet. So we don't really know for sure.
So lithium is plentiful in the world. It's mostly in the ocean, which just makes it difficult to extract. It's also, there's been very little search for lithium mines, because the current production is sufficient. It's mostly in South America, not only, but mostly in South America. It's in tough places, so there are environmental issues associated with this. There's a lot of water for mining, and in Argentina, in Chile. In Chile, it's in kind of in desertic place. So there are issues with this, but in principle, there's plenty of lithium. Also, we're moving to other metals, which will have less impact. So we're starting to work a lot on sodium batteries, even though sodium is twice as heavy as lithium, because lithium is, it's not the important weight in the battery. So the lithium part, the sodium would not be the major part of the weight, so that's not such an issue. So we will be developing other batteries, and indeed, we do very little recycling of lithium today, extremely little. When you take a battery today, lithium battery, what you want to recuperate is the cobalt, the expensive metal, and you don't even bother with lithium, because it's more expensive to extract the lithium from the battery than from the mine at the moment. But this will change also, because in large part by regulation. I mean, the countries will just say, okay, you have to recycle lithium batteries. It's not possible to leave it there, and it will happen. But it's not happening yet at the moment. But I'm not afraid that this will be an issue.
Thank you. We have another question from a Facebook viewer. So there's a perception that the seminar has been focused mainly on personal transportation, but what about the strategies of decarbonizing freight transportation, where GHG are growing even faster? Oh, yes, please.
I guess for the record, it's Jen Giuliano from University of Southern California. The freight sector is by far the most difficult sector relative to passengers. And the heavy-duty sector is the most difficult of the entire freight sector. It is going to be a long time before we have any technology that can pull the loads that heavy-duty trucks pull with any sort of feasible range from kind of a business perspective. So there's a lot going on. Just to share what's happening in Southern California is that the interim alternative seems to be low emissions natural gas and ultra low emissions diesel. Knowing that these technologies are going to be around at least for the next 2 or 3 decades. In the lighter duty trucks, there's more opportunity, but a lot depends on how the trucks are actually used.
So just what about hydrogen? Is it...
Well, hydrogen has exactly the same problem at this point. The hydrogen cell technology itself takes up about 1/3 of the trailer. So you lose so much in your ability to haul, and again, it doesn't have anything close to a range of a diesel truck.
Thank you.
You see, that's a tough question because nobody wants to answer. I would say, just to say, there's this also, the owner of Théo Taxi has a plan here. Théo Taxi is a company that has only electric taxis in Montreal, but they're planning to test electric trucks with changeable batteries over Montreal and Toronto, between Montreal and Toronto. So probably not the heaviest load, but kind of standard long-haul trailers. Yeah, but so they have to be changed like it's 600 kilometers, probably 6 times during and it's heavy.
The only thing I'll add is I am aware of some initiatives for maximizing the loads and coordinating loads. And I know there's initiatives like that going on probably in all the jurisdictions to make sure trucks don't go back empty, and that, if a truck is going to a downtown location, that, not everyone is ordering the same order that could all be in one truck. These sorts of city initiatives are going on probably in most big cities, at least to do the best we can with the trucks we currently have, which, still does actually reduce fuel consumption.
For greenhouse gases emissions, do you have an idea of the repartition between cars and trucks, and on the other side, other means like airplanes and boats and things like that? Because those are other kind of issues when you have to need another technology. Maybe nuclear engine for boats could be a good idea or no, I don't know. But so do you have a pie chart for that thing?
I don't have a pie chart, but we can get you a pie chart. They exist. But I think, I mean, looking out, they're really, a lot of the modeling, we were discussing this earlier, assumes some of it because they're assuming that the passenger vehicle miles will go down. Sometimes it's because of the population trends, and sometimes it's because of something baked into the model about looking at electrification, so the emissions would go down. But the heavy-duty sector, there really are projections of great, especially in aviation, great growth, and in freight. I mean, you just see even some of the changes that we're seeing with the internet economy increasing. Those aren't really in these models, but very big. And that's, you know, part of the reason I was focusing on this, you know, biofuels still. Even though the biofuels in the low carbon fuel standard, actually a lot of it is going into the diesel sector, but not exclusively. So even if you believe that biofuels aren't a good answer, you know, more broadly, there is this question of what to do about the heavy duty sector, and I mean, try to figure out how to do biofuels in a reasonable way now for that end.
So in Quebec, it's about 3/4 of the emission and transportation sectors are the road sector. Of this 3/4, about 2/3 is cars, so individual transportation, and 1/3 is freight, so big trucks. Off-road, this is about the rest, so 25%. There's maybe a quarter which is off-road because we have mining, we have industry, things like this that take this, and then you have airplane, which is not so much, is about 5%, less than 5% of the total, maybe 3-4%. But no, in terms of number of people being transported, it's not negligible. And you have also here railway, which is about the same as air. And you have, because you have to realize we just count air inside Quebec, so it doesn't count when you take and you go to Cancun or whatever. And you have also maritime, which is a bit half of that, something like that, off the top of my head. That's all.
I'll just add real briefly. I've always been told, and I think it is true, that the aviation sector is really hard to electrify, if not impossible. But I'll just say that this past weekend I was at a conference, and a speaker there who is an expert on renewables said that Airbus has a prototype. It's like it looks like a glide plane. Like, I don't think you're going to be flying to Cancun on this, but there's some, I guess, research and development on electrifying the aviation sector as well. I don't know how. I don't know what the.
We have a plane. It has been done once around the globe.
Okay.
One on an electric plane.
Slow. Anyway, so to maybe some others have some ideas about that as well.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is on the regulatory side. So, well, I'm actually just remembering this graph we had in the presentation in the workshop, and I'm trying to, and I think the heavy duty was the majority of I think it was a 2010 emissions, but I'm just trying to get the visual of it in my head. But in terms of, but the models would all change about in the future. How much of a cut would you get in the light duty versus the heavy duty, and then where would the changes be? We had some research at UC Davis just kind of ballparking how much storage it would take to have to be able to get enough hydrogen on an airplane, and just thinking about the airport, and it was just completely infeasible. There wasn't enough space in the airport to store the hydrogen. But also, from a regulatory standpoint, the marine piece is very difficult. So, I mean, the low carbon fuel standard is now probably going to expand into aviation, only on the credit side, not the deficit side of the ledger. So as an incentive, but not bringing the whole sector under control. But really not into the marine because it's just too easy to move somewhere else and fuel somewhere else. So that's what's called shuffling or leakage is a common problem. But it's really, it's so easy in marine that it's a disincentive to move the regulation in that direction unless you've got kind of a bigger block of jurisdictions.
We do have 2 minutes for one more question. Well, I guess it's going to be time for the cocktail then, Jennifer. Well, I would please give a big round of applause, final round of applause for our speaker. And thank you for joining us.